At the very beginning, I do think the issue is psychological. It's trauma related. But in Nurse's case is where we really start to see a switch first. The day after Nurse is sent to jail, we have Ann Putnam Jr., the one who sort of first accuses her, enter a room where her uncle is. And he says she entered the room and she has marks on her arm that like rings. And she says that one of the specters whipped her with a chain, and that's why she has these circles on her arm. And right away, we've gone from the mental world to the physical. If she had circles on her arm, either she pressed something against her arm to fake it, another person pressed something against her arm to fake it, or her uncle made the whole thing up.
Dan Gagnon, thank you for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you for having me on, Zach.
Yeah, of course. I'm excited to get into things. I know that you said you're currently recording in Danvers, Massachusetts, which used to be Salem. And I wanted to start off just by asking you, because you also grew up there, right?
I did, yeah.
Can you talk about what it was like to grow up in Danvers, formerly Salem, and how you started to become interested in the witch trials?
Living in Danvers, growing up in Danvers, that used to be known as Salem Village, is very much what led me to, I'm sure, write this book. Growing up in a town where you had these colonial homes, these monuments to victims of the witch hunt, really got me into it at a young age, in that I was interested in local history, and that is our local history, the most important event here. And so Danvers is next to the city of Salem where the trials took place, but many of the people, especially at the beginning involved in the witch hunt, lived here in Danvers. Danvers Salem Village is where the first accusations took place. And so that's really the center of where it started.
Was there any sort of moment or speech that you got from someone, or just because I'm trying to think, I grew up in Long Island, and there are a lot of historical landmarks throughout Long Island. Like the old Bethpage Village restoration is something that I went to 5 or 6 times as a kid, which is kind of like a recreation of what Long Island used to look like. But I didn't write a book on the old villages of Long Island, like the history of Long Island. So was there something that sort of cut more deeply that involved the actual witch trials that you can remember? Like something where not just like you kind of turn the corner in your own mind of, oh, this is something I'm super fascinated by.
Yeah, I would say there is a moment. My first job as a teenager was working at the Rebecca Nurse Homestead Museum, the only home of a victim of the witch trials that's preserved and open to the public. And I applied for that job just because it was, for a teenager, like the only like history related job that would have made sense. And after being there a couple of years in high school and college, and then continuing in other capacities, what really amazed me was that people come from truly all over the earth there. For people who live locally, it's this kind of out of the way farm tucked back from the street. It doesn't make a big visual impression if you drive by. It's there, people know it's there, but it's not seen as that huge of a deal. But to people from other parts of America and really all continents that come to see it, it's a huge deal. And so that really opened my eyes to, this isn't just something in our community, but this is something that people from all over care about. Yeah. And that's what drew me to it, because it had to be such a compelling story for those people to go.
Yeah, wow. So you'll get people that fly in from Switzerland to see the Salem Village and Rebecca Nurse's house, or just all over the planet. That's crazy.
Absolutely. Yeah, people from as far away as, like Australia, which is about as far away, I guess, from Danvers, Mass as you can get, from Japan, all over.
Yeah, no, that's nuts. I have a wedding later this year up in Maine, and I'm going to be based in Brooklyn. I'm in Panama now, working remotely, but I'm making plans to stop in Salem Village and visit the Rebecca Nurse house, because I think it would also be cool to meet in person on the way to Maine. And now you telling me that people fly in to see Salem Village, I'm like, well, that's not that big of a deal if I stop off on the way, but I'm still excited to see it.
Oh, that's cool. That's a good
Yeah.
idea.
Yeah. So the book that you wrote and the book that caught my attention is A Salem Witch: The Trial, Execution, and Exoneration of Rebecca Nurse. And I believe this is the first book of the witch trials to solely focus on only one of the accused, or maybe the first meaningful book to solely focus on one of the accused, which is Rebecca Nurse. That's correct, right?
Yeah, prior to this, there was no full standalone biography of like the full life of a victim. There was maybe a pamphlet here about this person's just one person's trial or time
Mm,
just during 1692, but not a full biography of the person's entire life that really brings a lot more meaning than just that one, week of their life when they're on trial.
yeah. So what stands out with Rebecca Nurse as a person to you amongst the other accused and the other victims of the witch trials? Because I believe there's over 200 people accused and 20 people that were executed. What made Rebecca Nurse stand out to you?
Well, I knew I wanted to write a standalone biography, and then my next question, of course, was, well, of who? There's so many
Yeah.
people in this, like you mentioned, about 200 people accused. I did not pick Rebecca Nurse just because of my, summer job at the Rebecca Nurse Homestead. I went through all the victims of the witch hunt to see whose story I thought could draw out really like the most truth, the most insight out of the event. And I settled on Rebecca Nurse because although she's accused early on in the witch hunt, when she's accused, she seems like one of the most unlikely people to be
Mm.
accused.
Do you think and I want to get into the unlikeliness, but just in terms of you working at the Rebecca Nurse Homestead, you don't think that had anything to do with it as well? Just being surrounded by her house. I don't know if you believe in energies coming off of inanimate objects. Maybe the spirit of Rebecca Nurse was somehow, or the memory of Rebecca Nurse was still instilled in the house. Did you feel in any way swayed by being in that presence for a large majority of the week?
That's an interesting question. I
Because I
wouldn't.
I was just gonna I asked that because I've definitely felt that before, not for a specific person, but walking into buildings that are meaningful, or maybe there's a darker thing behind them. I'll feel something like some sort of, and whether it's placebo or whether it's actually real, I don't know, but I've definitely felt that before.
I'm not sure I would have that sort of a connection, but I would say that philosophically there would have to be a connection in the sense of you feel like it's a place that matters to people's memory. That
Mm,
people are coming there who are so many of the visitors are descendants. And to them that is such a like personal family memory sort of trip that they make. And so that definitely had an impression.
yeah. So what made Rebecca Nurse such an unlikely person to be involved in the witch trials?
Well, historians have gone through statistics of the victims of the Salem witch hunt, as well as the few people accused of witchcraft before Salem in Massachusetts and Connecticut. And the only sort of, I guess, like high risk category that Rebecca Nurse was in
Mm,
was that she was a woman, and the overwhelming majority in colonial New England of witchcraft accusations are against women.
yeah. It's funny to to say that as a high risk category. Like they're keeping track of one category's weird occurrences, another category is slurred speech, and the third one is, oh, she's a woman. She obviously is involved in witchcraft. Like that's just as I was going through the book and also some of your other talks online, I guess it's tempting to put the morality on it's tempting to put the morality of today's time on the past and try to compare it. And not women obviously still have tons of problems that they're dealing with in society to battle for womanhood. But back in the day, it's hard for me to identify with the fact that woman equals witch. Like people joke about it, people talk about it, but like that, someone seeing a woman and having the emotion of, oh, she's a witch, and it not be ironic is wild.
Yeah, it was a really pervasive belief, and what it really just stemmed from was the idea that the Puritans and others in the 17th century viewed women as weaker and therefore just like more likely to be tricked by the devil into working for him.
Was it the what were they focusing on with the weaker aspect? Was it the physical, like they're saying women were physically weaker so that would make them vulnerable? Was it mental? Was it everything that they thought, or what was the weakness they were zeroing in on?
It would be both. It was just generally a diminutive perspective.
Yeah. Yeah, so she yeah, no, I mean I'm just taking in what you're saying, and there's so many directions that I feel like we could go. I wrote down one of the quotes from A Salem Witch about Rebecca Nurse's early life. I think that could be cool and a good tangent to get into. But you write in the book that much of Rebecca Nurse's life was spent raising and caring for her children. I think she had 8 children in a harsh and dangerous environment on the edge of wilderness. Can you talk about the harshness that Rebecca Nurse faced in her early life, even long before the trials?
Certainly. With Rebecca Nurse, when she first comes to Massachusetts as a young girl, she's still Rebecca Town as her maiden name.
Mm,
They came with a group of Puritans on the Great Migration sometime about 1635. On the one hand, their experience is fairly ordinary and similar to these other settlers, but what that means is it is very harsh. There's the arrival here and trying to build some sort of shelter while there's storms and hurricanes and then a cold winter. There's constant conflict with Native Americans in the area, constant wars. There's infighting. Even though almost everybody who arrives in the Salem area was a Puritan, there's still infighting amongst themselves
mm,
that some have a different idea of what being a
yeah.
Puritan should be. And so they left England because they were being persecuted in the Reformation. But when they get here, they don't get that stability that they had hoped for.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that's for sure is that the Puritans are super extremists by the way that you describe them in the book. I think you said in a talk that like being Catholic was adjacent to witchcraft for the Puritans, just to visualize, paint a picture of how extremist the Puritans actually were.
Yeah, with some of our accusations later in 1692, as we get into the spring and summer, people will be accused of like consorting with Native Americans who are the allies of the French Canadians in
Yeah,
Canada. They'll claim that some of the people that they've accused of witchcraft held a mockery of the
yeah.
Puritan communion service, but the way it's described is clearly described as like a Catholic mass in a very anti-Catholic way to tie them to that.
Yeah. And going back to the early settlers of the Puritan community, before reading this book, I visualized in my mind, like the finished product of Puritan society, which is they have the villages built up, they have nice clothes, the church is there, just like the pictures that I saw in a textbook in 8th grade. I'm like, oh, that must be, how things just appeared when they got to America. And then you describe the living in like basically like wigwam shacks early on. They're fighting off natives left and right. I think they were at war with the French too. So it's like all these, you're already living in harsh conditions in general back in the late 17th century. And then you have all this shit thrown on top of you. Just the trauma and craziness, and just sitting in that for a moment to appreciate that was really eye-opening to me when I was going through the book.
Good. And I think the way that you sort of describe that is very important. The idea that they are kind of on the edge of, are they going to survive or not. And
Yeah.
that tension, and use the word trauma, which I think comes up in the witch hunt further down the road here, that it has to be ever present, unfortunately, in their lives.
Yeah, no, the true. I'm so lucky to have been born into a time and born into a place where I've never really been on the brink of survival. Like never wondering, am I going to be shanked in my wigwam tent, or where's my next meal coming from? And there are a lot of people that still do live in that state, and it sounds like the Puritan community as a whole, constantly had like that survival switch flipped on, at least in the early days. Like, what the fuck is going to happen? Like, you can never really relax.
Yeah, and then the fear extends to weird natural occurrences, hurricanes that might bring a flood, and then you connect it to your other fears. Was it somehow the Native Americans? Was it somehow the devil? And so all of their survival fears somehow interconnect, which I think kind of compounds the fear and the stress.
Yeah. So when does the first strangeness start in Salem?
So with Salem Village, it's going to be at the very beginning of the year 1692.
Yeah.
And it's about the time that Rebecca Nurse is turning 71. So she has been in the area for a while. And it starts in the home of the Salem Village minister, Reverend Paris. His niece, his young daughter, who are 9 and 11, start screaming and contorting. And it almost looks like, to our modern view, they're having some sort of seizure. But then they say they see shapes. And then they say the shapes that they see are somehow hurting them. And that's why they're having seizures.
And so it starts under the roof of Reverend Paris, his daughter and niece, you said.
Yeah, and because it starts with him, there were a lot of writers in the late 19th century and the 20th century who had put forth that the whole thing was some sort of conspiracy, that somehow Reverend Paris had done this on purpose, and that this was somehow to get back at his political enemies. One of the key things I found was Reverend Paris was already basically halfway fired at this point, and it would not have been in his interest to do this, and he does not take advantage of it like some people claimed he did at all. He does go on to testify against some people, including Rebecca Nurse, but it's not his. It's not a conspiracy. It's not that it's not a plot.
Yeah, wasn't there a land dispute? Was that Reverend Paris the same guy where he basically laid claim to the minister's house in Salem? Was that him? Where he was basically like, "This is mine now," and forged some documents?
That's exactly it. So in 1689, when he was hired, he negotiated really hard for his contract because he had come from wealth and he wanted to be compensated more than. You have to remember, Salem Village is a tiny farm village, basically on the frontier. Like, not a lot of money here, not a lot of wealth.
Yeah, and also you coming from a wealthy family, I'm sure he's dealt with lawyers before, as opposed to other people who are like, I have no sort of legal competence whatsoever. Like we came here, we've been poor for generations. I have no concept of what a lawyer is. So he had that going for him too.
Yeah, and he himself had gone to Harvard. He drops out before he graduates because his family loses their money, but he's well educated. Yeah, he'd be a tough person for someone in Salem Village to try to negotiate against. But one of the things he wanted in his contract was ownership of the parsonage, which is the home of the minister in a New England town or village. And it's kind of an unheard of request that there's almost no town or village at that point, with one or two very unique exceptions, where the minister owned it. It was always like public property. It's like the White House, that the president lives there when they have the job, but they don't actually own it. The parsonage, the minister lives there for the length of his contract, but he doesn't own it.
So is that when he forges the documents to sort of, or allegedly forges documents to get ownership of that parsonage?
It seems to be his request is denied. They sign his contract. It doesn't include that. And it seems like things move along. But then it's just a couple months before the weird activity behavior of those young girls in his home. It's the fall of 1691, where other villagers discover that document in the town meeting records and are livid. It wasn't him who wrote it. We have many examples of Reverend Parris's handwriting, and it doesn't match. But clearly somebody wrote it for him in the town record book.
Gotcha. So you don't think there's any connection between the episodes, the freakish episodes of Abigail and Betty Williams under Reverend Parris's roof, and the allegedly forged contract, or like his squabble with owning the parsonage?
I think that there's a connection, but not in the sense of pre-planned or taking revenge. I think the connection is really psychological, in that when the village found out about this apparent fraud, they tell him that they're going to cancel his contract and not pay him anymore. And so that winter, he has a full house. He has to feed them. He has to keep it warm. And he's now told he's not getting paid. They might freeze to death. They might starve. And again, put back to the brink of survival, that amount of stress, the little girls would have heard their parents like true deep worries, and that maybe it starts as some sort of stress related symptoms there. I would think that would be a connection.
Yeah, no, that's true. If there's this survival instinct again, if you're truly begging to survive, you don't really have the energy to plot to the point of orchestrating your daughter and your niece to make believable, demonic contortions or something. Like your time is spent elsewhere. So I have it. Had a quote from. Oh, here it is. So you describe the actual episodes of Betty and Abigail, and I think they're worth listening to for people tuning in, because it is very jarring. So you write that these two girls, referring to Betty Parris and Abigail Williams, climbed into holes, crawled under furniture, and struck sundry odd postures and antic gestures, uttering foolish, ridiculous speeches which they've never themselves nor any others could make sense of. They folded themselves into contortions that were nearly impossibles for human beings to accomplish. One witness wrote, quote, "Their motions in their fits are preternatural, both as to the manner, which is so strange, as well as a person could not screw their body into. And as to the violence, also it is preternatural, being much beyond the ordinary force of the same person when they're in their right mind." Reverend John Hale added, "These children were bitten and pinched by invisible agents, their arms, necks, and backs turned this way and that way, and then returned back again." So it sounds like some shit you'd see in a movie like The Conjuring, with, contortions that you can't explain, that don't look manageable to the human body.
That seems like a fair comparison. It is that unnatural, that wild. And the passage from the book there are quoting people who are well educated and people who have been around Salem Village for a long time also, or the area for a long time, and aren't people you would assume were that gullible, or people who would have a reason to make this up. Reverend John Hale's the minister in the town next door, Beverly. He's not really in on this in the beginning. They call him over basically as a witness to get his opinion of what's going on. Yeah. So he has like no horse in the race at that point. So that description is reliable, but it's important to note he doesn't say it looked like they were bit or it looked like they were pinched. He says they were bit. So he believes this when he arrives.
Yeah, these children were bitten and pinched by invisible agents, which is also, it's a through line to the trials as you describe them, because, and we'll get into the actual trial, but one of the things is that there's a lot of assumptions, like these children were bit, or like, how long were you a witch? Not like, are you a witch? What, just like people that are so sure what they're seeing is coming from the thing that first, pops into their head. Like, it has to be this.
And I think a lot of it comes from this very beginning when they see
Yeah.
these fits, and if there's no other explanation they could have, then you assume that is true, and all the other assumptions come from that. They come from the fits being true.
Yeah. So when does the vibe in Salem start to transform from the kids are sick or there's something wrong to there's evil, there's witchcraft afoot?
Takes about a month. So the first fits, the unusual behaviors, are at the end of January 1692 and into February. And what we'll see first is that they are questioned when it's only two of them that are having fits, and it's the village doctor who's called. He's not really called until there's others who are also having fits. So it seems like Reverend Parris tried to keep it quiet when it was just like his two children.
Yeah.
But after it spreads, they call doctors, and one doctor says they are under, quote, an evil hand. So the doctor is the one who says it's witchcraft. And again, you typically trust your doctor, and people believed that was the truth.
Do you have any theories why witchcraft re-popped up around this time, like the accusations of witchcraft in general? Because it wasn't for a long time, like it wasn't at this rate, like certainly not like 20 people in a year, like just for Puritan society as a whole. Was it just like that pure survival instinct that was making everyone crazy? Was it a combination of things? Like, what are your main theories about that?
Well, you're right that this is different. It's very different in 1692. Never before had that many people, about 200 people, been accused at once. Elsewhere in Massachusetts, in the 1600s, you had one person or maybe a husband and wife, but it was all like one-off situations. And for the couple decades before Salem, even if people were accused, juries did not find them guilty. Or if they did, the judges just threw out the charges. You had skepticism, real skepticism. I think with your question about the survival instinct, we see that here. Suddenly around 1692, things start going so bad for Massachusetts with economic trouble, wars with the French Canadians, who are close. The French soldiers do get all the way through New Hampshire to what's now the border of Massachusetts and New Hampshire. So they come a long way from Quebec City.
Yeah.
Native Americans fighting as well. They're going to have some illnesses. And I think that makes the skepticism go away. It's as if the world is ending. Everything is going wrong.
So it's kind of like, fuck it mentality. We can't afford to have another thing. We can't afford to have another blame on us, kind of, that we have to confront. It must be out of our hands, sort of like witchcraft. Like, is it kind of that? Like they don't want it to be an enemy they could actually defeat. They're kind of offloading it onto something that you can't see.
That is one theory. In particular with the wars with the Native Americans, the idea that colonial leaders, it was Mary Beth Norton who wrote a book on this about the wars in Maine, which was still Massachusetts back then. And the idea that the colonial leaders were failing and thought that people would start blaming them. They are failing in the war on the frontier. They're failing the colony. At this point, they've actually lost their self-government to a new royal governor picked by the king instead of electing their leaders. Like, Massachusetts is basically over from what it was in the 1600s, and people would be really mad at the people who had been Massachusetts' leaders. So yeah, they can deflect. They can say, well, we lost these battles, we're losing this war against the French, but it's because the witches are helping them. It's not because we're bad at our job.
Yeah. No, I wonder if that's a conscious psychological mechanism, like a psychological band-aid, that when you're so overwhelmed, your brain, whether you realize it or not, just starts exploring the supernatural. Like, you're so overwhelmed by what you can see and can feel and can taste, touch, that your brain can't even comprehend another threat. Like I wonder if there are other societies around this time, or maybe under similar circumstances as the Puritans, that also do you know if there were other people, maybe not in the same situations as colonies, but just around the world, where there would have been zero communication with the Puritans, but these people were also having witch trials, or blaming witchcraft on certain occurrences?
I'm not sure I would say zero contact with the Puritans. Earlier in the 1600s, in the region around Great Yarmouth where Rebecca Nurse left, it was after she left, they had witch trials. But one example I think that kind of hits on your point, I think that might be an example, is Germany during the religious wars of the Reformation. At one face level, you have all these witchcraft accusations of Catholics accusing Lutherans, Lutherans accusing Catholics, or Calvinists as the mix changed. And it's all right, well, on the one hand, that's straightforward. On the other hand, people in Germany also were thinking that that was the end of the world. Their towns were being wrecked by army after army. There were diseases, starvation. And that's another example, I think, of people just absolutely overwhelmed by very real problems. But maybe that also led them into a supernatural blame.
Yeah, similar types of pressures between both societies, it sounds like. So how does Rebecca Nurse, 71, 70 years old at the time, she was 70, right?
Yeah, she's 70 when it starts and turns 71 soon after.
So how does 70-year-old Rebecca Nurse become accused of witchcraft? Like how does that sort of enter the zeitgeist of Salem?
So when this all begins, she is really not in it at all. She's a very well-respected member of the village. She was chosen as a church member of the Salem Town Church when she lived downtown in Salem, that only 10% of the people who showed up to church every Sunday got that level of respect as being voted in as a member. Her family is doing fairly well. She has 8 kids that are becoming adults. They're not in great financial straits, so they're not really enviable, but they're working.
Oh, yeah.
And she is home ill as this unfolds. So she really is not present. She's home. The records, she mentions it's some illness related to her stomach that we kind of will never know exactly what that means. And so she hears about these fits, and then the fits spreading, and then she hears about the first few people being accused from family members that had been out and about in the village, coming back and telling her. And from records we have, she's really sympathetic. She says she's praying for the people who are afflicted, that she might not know exactly what's wrong, but she does believe they're being hurt badly by something.
Yeah. So she has sympathy for them, and she's lying sick at the same time. You said her family was not particularly well off financially either.
Yeah, they had purchased a large farm, 300 acres in Salem Village, about 14 years before the witch hunt. That's when they moved from downtown Salem to Salem Village. But they could only do so because their oldest children were married, and like they were in on the purchase too. They also got the world's best mortgage of no money down and tiny payments every year.
There you go. I do a lot of filthy things for that in New York. That's for sure. Anywhere really. But yeah, so she's lying sick in bed. When do the whispers start about Rebecca Nurse? Like, when does that start to pop off?
So it's about mid-March. At this point in time, the first 3, Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and Tituba, had been arrested and sent to jail to await trial. Martha Corey is in the next one, arrested, sent to jail to await trial. And then Rebecca Nurse will be number 5, the 5th person formally accused.
Yeah, and Tituba is the sort of like the slave maid of Reverend Paris.
Yeah. So she's the first one that'll be accused. And there's, when we were talking at the beginning about ways historians have kind of calculated risk for someone being
Hmm.
accused of witchcraft, she unfortunately checked very, very, very many boxes. She's a woman,
Hmm.
not English, in a town full of English people. She's not originally a Puritan. She's not from there. She's a slave, the lowest part of their society at
Hmm.
the time. And she had been brought to Salem Village by Reverend Paris. Paris was
Hmm.
rich because his father and uncle owned a plantation down in Barbados. And Tituba and her husband, John Indian, are two enslaved people he brings. And Tituba, there's different theories. She's not an African slave. She's
Hmm.
described as an Indian. So she's a native, maybe to the Caribbean. Many historians think native to kind of like the area around Venezuela, like the top of South
Gotcha.
America.
And then Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne were, uh, weren't they kind of like beggars around town, or maybe one of them was sort of speak like saying things at people, kind of like a typical homeless person.
Yeah, Sarah Good. Sarah Good had a rough life and was had been widowed and had kids, and she's married at this point but fighting with her husband constantly, and she would walk door to door asking for alms, asking for essentially spare change in a modern
Hmm.
sense. When someone said no, they said that she'd walk away muttering, which
Mm.
seemed like vengeance. But the second part is the Puritans had a very low opinion of poor people. They, in many ways, are like very harsh in society, but they
Mm.
believed that you were poor for a reason and you must have done something wrong.
Yeah. And she's muttering, she must be a witch. That checks
Mm-hmm.
another box. So do we know who specifically accuses Rebecca Nurse, or is it more of like a uh, just something like a town rumor?
So they'll all develop into rumors, which is how
Yeah,
we get back to the Nurse family.
gotcha.
What's fascinating with Nurse, and it is, well, we think different than the other cases. It's not clear exactly the first accusation. Who first said the word Rebecca Nurse connected to witchcraft? Her own
Hmm.
family tries to figure this out the week that she's accused and arrested, and they can't. They know it comes from someone in the household of the Putnam family.
Mm.
They know that Ann Putnam Jr., I say that because her mother is also Ann Putnam. Um, Ann Putnam Jr. Has these visions. She becomes afflicted, and she tells her family, so they recount, that she sees it's an older woman, and this older woman sits in the same pew as her grandmother every Sunday in the meeting house. Well, they sat by sex and then by age. So everybody in her grandmother's pew would have been an old
Yeah.
Puritan woman. That really doesn't give you any info. And then someone, she says, in her household says, "Oh, you must mean Rebecca Nurse."
Mm.
But after the fact, all of the people in that household, all the women in that household who were afflicted, each said it was another one of them.
Mm.
Nobody will take ownership of, I first suggested to Ann Putnam Jr. that it was Rebecca Nurse.
That's interesting because I take that as at least some sign of feeling guilty about the accusation, is not being willing to come forward and say I'm the one making the accusation, because it's not like you know you don't get thrown in jail for making false accusations right at this point in history. Like it wouldn't be a risk to say I'm the one who accused Rebecca Nurse, would it? Or am I completely wrong?
No, not to say the first. By the time the Nurse family is they're basically interviewing members of the Putnam family. Rebecca Nurse's son and son-in-law walk over there the day after she's sent to jail and say,
Mm.
like, why? Like, who first did it? And that wouldn't have held you legally liable. There are names basically on the arrest warrant, but those were men in the Putnam family. Only men could do legal paperwork. And so
Yeah.
they signed their names on behalf of the family. So in theory, if anybody if it was exposed as a fraud, it actually would be Ann Putnam's father and uncle that would be legally responsible. None of the women.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if she doesn't have a lot of money, she's old and sick. I guess the only thing left for motive would be some sort of situation or like like you said, someone says her name offhand and then everyone just runs with it without even thinking about it. Because if they weren't going after uh, the land or money, they weren't going after something else, then I don't know what else, someone would be jealous about or want to take her down for.
I think you're right. I think it's a name is mentioned, and whenever one of the accusers mentions the name, the other afflicted accusers all jump in and also accuse that person, and so it just happened again, but it was a fluke. But once they've made the accusation, they're kind of committed.
Yeah. So did the townspeople of Salem have any names or catchphrases for the witch hunt, like witches or bitches or cast a spell, go to hell, something like that? Because I'm just thinking every movement we have today has some sort of name or slogan, like Black Lives Matter, Me Too, Deflate Gate, like anything that becomes literally like people are like, we need a name for this. Was there any sort of catchphrase for the witch hunt back in the day?
No, there's not. It's not like there's one term that everybody uses. They'll use similar language in their accusations, which is, I was grievously afflicted by this person. Reverend Paris, in his sermons, he has dark, gloomy sermons about evil being everywhere, but so did pretty much all the ministers, so he's not really unique at that point. He'll talk about the devil amongst us. He has a sermon where he says, the devil hath been raised.
That's a good one.
That's one that comes up. Yeah, that's I named a chapter after that. I had to use that one.
Yeah, there you go. I put that on the back of my carriage. For sure. What was the legal system like in 1692? Like, were there rights of the accused, prosecutors, defense attorneys, jail conditions? Like, I'm just curious what that was like.
That's an area where I think we get a lot of misconceptions. When you see, I don't know, some more sensational movie or like television pseudo documentary about the witch trials, it's like a mob with torches and pitchforks, and then they just kill somebody like without a trial. It's like a lynching. Like, no. That's a big misconception.
Yeah, like someone just says witch and points in a general direction, and then whoever, it's like spin the bottle for witches. Whoever the bottle aims at, everyone just charges with fire and pitchforks. That's what it's like in the movies.
It totally is. And that is not the case. Each person accused did have their day in court. Their legal process was in many ways extraordinarily similar to our current legal system. It's still New England. It's still America, with, important differences also. When you were first accused, you were brought before two judges in your town. So Rebecca Nurse was brought to the Ingersoll Tavern in Salem Village, then to the Meeting House, where she appeared before John Hathorne, related to Nathaniel Hawthorne there, and Jonathan Corwin, whose house is the so-called Witch House in Salem. And day one, she had the right to talk. She's questioned. And the idea was, is this legitimate or is this a frivolous accusation? And their decision, they could have released her or they could have sent her to jail to await a full trial. And they will send basically everybody to jail to await a trial in 1692.
So when someone was first accused, was there the air of assumption of witchcraft? Because later on in the book, you talk about a lot of the questions were asked were leading questions, like how long have you been a witch? Was it from the accusation and, immediately the judges were like, okay, you're a witch, but like, let's figure this out? Or was there some leeway with the victims? Like it could go either way.
With most victims, there is not much leeway. They will be, on that first day at her first hearing, really kind of swayed by her statements of innocence. The two judges are just supposed to be like fact-finding. Like, all right, we've had this accusation. is there actually any evidence? Like, they're not deciding innocence or guilt. That's for a trial. But just trying to see, like, is this legitimate? And with Nurse, or with almost all, their first question is something along the lines of, how long have you been a witch?
Yeah.
Not, are you one or are you not, but how long? So they do
how
assume
long?
guilt.
I think something else worth mentioning along with the depiction of witches in the movies is that you typically think of the minister sort of being the one to always lead the charge to get the witches. And you talk about a lot of the ministers actually being against witchcraft or like being very vocal, doubtful at the very least, vocally against at the very most. So I thought that's also an interesting difference.
Yeah, we often see in some of those like television programs that it is somehow church led, and it's not really how the Puritan church worked. It's the civil government. It's the government of Massachusetts. It's two regular government judges. Really, I think part of our misunderstandings about like the ministry, the ministers, is that Reverend Parris does believe that this is true, and so he is really into it. But the ministers elsewhere across Boston and the rest of Massachusetts, they believe in witchcraft. They're not doubting this. They just have process issues. They're afraid that you haven't had enough evidence to convict people. So they're really concerned about how, not really like the what, but the how.
What is the actual, what does the layout of the courtroom look like? Does that look close to modern day with the judge at the front pulpit, then it's prosecutor, defense? Was there an audience? Like what was sort of that layout?
It's very similar to today. So when we get to the full trials with you had a 12-man jury sitting, we presume, on like the side, like you would today, or in a corner or something. The final trials, the court that's set up had up to 9 judges. They didn't all attend every trial, but you'd have multiple judges sitting at tables up front. Rebecca Nurse would be standing like with the audience to her back, facing the judges up front. She had to stand the whole time you were on trial back then. And yeah, the audience was packed. People for her, people against her, and we have descriptions of some trials which took place in a building in downtown Salem that no longer exists. People were crowding around the windows outside. There was a crowd around the doorway. It was public. And the initial hearings, when she first appeared before the judges, were also public. Anybody could attend.
Yeah. And the way you describe the jails where Rebecca Nurse and the other accused spent a lot of time, I'm not surprised either. Like you said something like it was very wet, but it wasn't water. They're just basically sitting in excrement, waiting to be taken to and from the courthouse. And I can imagine that as a 30-year-old person, but as a 70-year-old sick woman, just surviving the waiting period before the trial is a feat. Like that's insane conditions to be just thrown in and kind of left there.
It really is for somebody of her age and health. So she's sent to jail in the 20s of March, and her trial doesn't occur until the end of June, and then she will be executed in July. So she's all that time in jail, and people do die in jail. People who are younger and healthier than her die.
Yeah, a determined as hell woman, for sure. You write that the original outbreak was likely based on mental illness, but as the case against Rebecca Nurse progressed, her accusers used intentional deception and fraudulent evidence. And the evidence sort of takes on a life of its own. It grows, it morphs as the trial goes on. Can you get into some of that deception and fraudulent evidence mounted against Rebecca Nurse and how it evolved as the trial progressed?
Yeah, so as you read at the very beginning, I do think the issue is psychological. It's trauma related. We have stress and conversion disorder. But in Nurse's case is where we really start to see a switch first. The day after Nurse is sent to jail, we have Ann Putnam Jr., the one who sort of first accuses her, enter a room where her uncle is. Her uncle's her next door neighbor.
Hmm.
And her uncle writes this document, so it's his perspective. And he says she entered the room and she has marks on her arm that like rings. And she says that one of the specters whipped her with a chain, and that's why she has these circles on her arm.
Yeah.
And right away, we've gone from the mental world to the physical. If she had circles on her arm, either she pressed something against her arm to fake it, another person pressed something against her arm to fake it, or her uncle made the whole thing up and there were never circles
Mm.
on her arm and he just wrote it on paper. But either way, we immediately get to one that's like, this cannot be real. It's not clear whose fault or who's the one
Yeah.
lying, but somebody has to be lying here.
Yeah. Can you explain exactly what specters are and what there's how people are describing these specters?
Absolutely, yeah. So the Puritan view of witchcraft is that somebody has forsaken their community in the church and they've signed up to work for the devil. You do that to destroy Massachusetts, the Commonwealth, the church, and you got special powers to do it. You could use those special powers on your own time to like settle grudges or whatever, but you're supposed to use it for the devil. And one of these powers is you could send an image. It looks just like you. It's like a ghost of yourself. You're still
Mm.
alive, but it's like a ghost of you. And you could send that to hurt people. That's what they believe the specters is. Ann Putnam Jr. will say that Rebecca Nurse's image appears up above with some invisible chain also and hits her. Rebecca Nurse is in jail. The
Mm.
problem with specters is because of their beliefs, it will ruin any alibi because you don't physically have to be there.
Yeah. No, yeah, I mean it's it's a really good loophole to be like, I saw you robbing the liquor store, and you're like, well, there's video footage of me at work, and you're like, well, it was your specter that robbed the liquor store.
Exactly.
Checkmate. But yeah, because that's something, it happens to not just Rebecca Nurse, but it happens to a lot of different people where they're accused of being somewhere and then they say, well, I wasn't there, and then it must have been your specter, it's not you then.
Yeah, and they'll have specters. One is a former Salem Village minister, George Burroughs. His specter is hurting people in Salem Village. He's on the frontier in Maine. He's
Yeah.
very far away, and they send people to arrest him because they saw his specter in Salem
Yeah.
Village.
So the Puritans believe that when you turn yourself over to witchcraft, there's some ceremony with the devil. The devil comes to them either, in their dream, or like, what do they think happens when the devil comes to a person to sign the contract?
Well, there is actually a contract to sign. The Puritans are very legalistic when it comes to contracts. It has a big impact on how America develops, is that we're all based on contracts. It's really the Puritans. So they believe the devil appears to you, or it could be another witch that's already signed their contract might appear to you. But either way, they hand you a contract to work for the devil. They call it the devil's book because it was like bound as a book. And you had to write your name into
Yeah.
it. It's described in some instances as being red ink. They never say directly blood, but when they say red ink, you can tell what they're trying to get
Yeah.
at.
Yeah, it's funny to think about all the wild, ethereal, supernatural accusations, and then when the devil comes to you, the Puritans are still like, well, of course it's bound legally by
Yeah.
human. Of course, there's still pen and paper. That'd be ridiculous if there was no contract. That's crazy to think about. Something I also wanted to ask is, were there any people, like, what percentage do you think of the village, whether out loud or in their mind, was calling bullshit on these accusations that these people were coming forward saying specters were harassing them or doing terrible things to them, even physical evidence as you described? What percentage of people do you think were just like, yeah, I don't think, like, even if they didn't know the source of it, they're like, I don't know if this is witchcraft?
I would say at the beginning, very, very few, almost none, would have been against it or that level of skepticism. But I think that it grows quickly. With each person you've accused, you've probably now alienated their family, one would imagine, because
Mm-hmm.
they know their family member is innocent.
Yeah.
So it'll grow, the skepticism will grow quickly, but it's just at the beginning reactions to a specific accusation. They still, even if the Nurse family is defending Rebecca Nurse, we assume they still believed in witchcraft.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And even there, we have one of Rebecca Nurse's sons-in-law had his name on documents accusing one of the prior people of Rebecca Nurse. He'll then defend Nurse, but clearly he believed in witchcraft.
Yeah. And during the trial itself, Rebecca's Nurse's family is extremely involved, right? They're helping to build her defense, which you say is also something that separates her, is that a lot of people didn't have the help of their family.
Yeah, that is key to her case. With the court system being a little different, you didn't have a defense attorney. You could have somebody help you gather evidence, like they called it an agent, basically. But defense attorneys just didn't exist. It just was not a category in English law. It did not exist. And so it's her husband and sons that prepare her defense because she's in jail. She can't go collect papers from somebody. Yeah. And so if people didn't have anyone on the outside to defend them, you were very sunk at trial. But her family takes great risk. By standing up for her, there were instances where multiple people in a family were accused, and any of them could have been next. Yeah.
Are you hearing I'm hearing like a little crackling noise. Do you hear that? Oh no, it just stopped. Okay, I think we're good. Sorry about that. It might have been some interference. But yeah, that's a good point. I want to get into the verdict of Rebecca Nurse, because there's this crazy flip that happens in the courtroom where there's two verdicts and there's a break in between the verdicts and the jury's deliberating. What can you describe, or can you tell the story of that flip and what occurs in the courtroom when it comes to the verdict of Rebecca Nurse?
Yes. So June of 1692, Nurse is on trial in downtown Salem. The prosecution presented their evidence of people who were also actively having their fits during her trial. Then the defense gets to present its evidence. Just as today, her family had gone up, presented evidence that people saying she had always been a good person. People also accusing the afflicted accusers of having lied in the past, like destroying the accuser's reputation. It's very solid. Best defense out of anybody on trial. Then, 12-man jury deliberates. We believe they leave and they go into a room next door or somewhere else in this building. Some amount of time passes and they return. And when they return, their first verdict is not guilty, which really is like an earthquake. Everybody up till this has been found guilty. The evidence against Nurse is the same evidence as against everybody. So if she's not a witch, that also immediately raises questions about every single other person charged with that same evidence.
Yeah.
And there's an outcry. The afflicted accusers start having their fits right on the floor. People are shocked. The judges, some of them, we have a description of them being furious. One stomps off the bench. One says they're going to indict her again because she actually hadn't been indicted for every person that accused her. They had just done like the main accusations. So in theory, they could have done that again.
Gotcha.
But the Chief Justice here acts, which is your question about the multiple verdicts. William Stoughton, the Chief Justice, very into the witch hunt and believer that it was right. He asks the jury to reconsider their verdict, which he could do, but the jury could also say, no, we're done. He convinces, basically, the jury to go leave and reconsider because he said there was a piece of evidence that hadn't been presented to them. The jury goes for it and apparently are willing to hear that evidence. And the one phrase is, Rebecca Nurse is standing up front in this large room. Witnesses against her are being brought in through the door behind her. She turns around and says, why do you bring them, these two women, why do you bring them isn't she one of us? Or if someone else wrote down, aren't they one of our company? Meaning the same thing.
Mm.
Well, like, that's fine. She meant they're also in jail with me. You really can't have people charged with the same crime, like testifying against you. That's fishy, even back then. So
Yeah.
she's pointing out, like, basically, like, you're having my cellmate testify against me.
Yeah.
But what she didn't know is that that person had falsely confessed to being a witch. And so Stoughton says, one of us, she just confessed in court. You can't find someone who confesses not guilty. Which, I mean, you
Mm.
can see the logic in that even today. If somebody, like, pleads guilty, you can't find them not guilty. That doesn't make sense.
Yeah. Clearly no double jeopardy laws back then.
No. And so the jury does leave. Apparently they think that this is interesting enough to talk about it. They come back and they're still not convinced. They return to ask her questions. What did you, basically along the lines of, well, what did you mean by this? But she's 71. She's been standing for hours at this trial. She's ill. We know she's hard of hearing. And whatever answer she gives them, the foreman of the jury wrote down, within days, he wrote down, really, she didn't answer our questions properly, and that made the jury suspicious.
Mm.
So then they leave, and they'll return with a guilty verdict, all because in her physical state, she didn't answer their questions fully or the way that they were asked. And that's really what it all hinged on.
Yeah. So the two prisoners come in the courtroom to testify against Rebecca Nurse. Rebecca Nurse is sitting there. She says the expression, one of us. That's not the full thing she says. And then, and I'm just reiterating just to make sure I have it. The audience, jury, congregation, they think that Rebecca Nurse is saying one of us, like we're witches, like acknowledging it under her breath or something like that. But she means one of us prisoners, like we were just sitting in jail together. This is weird. Why would you be allowed to testify against me?
Yeah, and it's only Stoughton who, as far as we know, there's nobody else seems to have mistaken that phrase. Only the Chief Justice assumes the worst. That's the only one we know who is on record as thinking that in the negative way.
Okay. So yeah, and then they question Rebecca Nurse. She doesn't give an answer that's, I guess good enough to explain it, or she's silent, I guess. And I mean, she's been sitting in shit for months, so like literal shit in a jail. So it makes sense why she'd be physically and mentally debilitated, beyond physically and mentally, tired at this point. And then that, like her sort of weird or non-answer is kind of like the nail in the coffin for the flip of the verdict to guilty.
It's what it is. It's not that her answer was wrong. It's just that her answer didn't apparently line up with their questions. And so she will write this. Well, a family member will write this for her, and she signs it in a petition to the governor, wanting basically like an appeal, because she says, being hard of hearing, I didn't understand. And she says it's only after the trial that someone in the family explains to her why the jury changed their mind. Like, she, in that moment, didn't even understand, like, what went wrong.
Yeah. So then she's found guilty. Is she hung later that day, or is there a break in between? What sort of happens in between the guilty verdict and when she gets hung?
So there is a gap. The court met in sessions every 3 weeks. It would meet for 1 week. So there were a couple people tried before her. There'll be a couple people tried the days after her. Then they get all the paperwork together that everybody is found guilty. It's a perfect conviction, right? And they have to send the paperwork in for the Chief Justice to sign it. It takes about 2.5, 3 weeks. He'll sign it in Boston, but not before the Nurse family had tried to appeal to the governor to get a reprieve, which is just a pause. It's not a pardon. It's just a pause until you can have an appeal or a retrial. And it seems like he did grant this. And we have it written then that some Salem gentleman got to the governor and he withdrew that reprieve. And then so that's why she ends up hanging as one of the half dozen women that day. She even had yet one more chance, and we don't know who got to the governor, but when they say some Salem gentlemen, two of the judges are Corwin and Hawthorne, the two judges from Salem.
Yeah.
And so that's one idea. We don't know. We know that they were actually with the governor that week before he granted the reprieve and changed his mind. So maybe it was them.
Yeah. I pulled out an excerpt from the book describing the excommunication rite before Nurse was hanged. And I assume they did this for everyone, not just Nurse, because it sounds like it was a Puritan, or I think it says in the excerpt it's a Puritan ceremony, and this gives a good insight into the Puritan mindset. So the excerpt is, quote, "The guards brought Rebecca Nurse into the meeting house after the vote and took her to the front as her chains dragged behind her. What happened next was the most shocking and scandalous of Puritan ceremonies, and 1692 was the last year that the Salem Town Church ever performed this excommunication rite. The Puritans viewed those cast out of the church as irredeemable and subject to all the cruelties of hell. Jonathan Edwards, a generation later, described the afterlife that awaited those locked out of heaven. Quote, their heads, their eyes, their tongues, their hands, feet, and loins, their vitals shall be forever full of glowing, melting fire, fierce enough to melt the very rocks and elements, and also shall be eternally full of the most quick and lively sense to feel the torment. They shall know that they shall never cease relentlessly, or they will never cease restlessly to plunge and roll in the mighty ocean of fire. They will know that those billows of fire that are greater than the highest of waves will never cease to roll over them, one following another, forever and ever. This was the fate of the church. This was the fate that the church members unanimously decided for Nurse." So they couldn't just hang Rebecca Nurse and put her out of her misery. They also had to be like, and Satan's gonna shit in your eyeballs when you get to hell. And then boom, like, well, we're just dancing on your grave at this point.
And she gets this extra level because her and also Giles Corey at the very end, in the fall of 1692, they were those full church members, that 10% that were full members of the church. And so that's why they get basically ceremonially thrown out of the church. Not all of the people executed for witchcraft got that.
Yeah.
Only those who had previously, in order to be that top 10%, you had to be voted in, you had to be seen as a good, holy person. So it's just those formal church members.
Yeah. So once Rebecca Nurse and the other accused are hanged, does this suddenly, cure the accusers of their ailments? Like, what happens to the people that were flailing in court and, putting on these convulsive displays?
It continues after Nurse and several other women are hanged on July 19th. It continues because they've accused other people that are still in jail awaiting trial. And so they say those people are now afflicting them. It continues, but with a new person as the specter. And there'll be another round of executions in August, another round in September, and then the court planned to meet again before it will be shut down by the Massachusetts government.
Yeah, that's and it was 20 people total in 1692, right?
Yeah, there's 19 hanged, one pressed to death.
And 200 accused?
We think it's about 200. Yeah. We have in the high 100s in terms of like the paperwork, but we do assume that not every piece of paper has survived until today.
How big is the town of Salem at this time? What's the population?
We have not much. We think in Salem Village, that one section was about 400, 500, and the rest of Salem about 1,500. It's like 2,000 between the two communities. But these accusations have spread beyond Salem. They've spread to people in Andover, people in Charlestown, which is now Boston, people to the north, like George Burroughs was all the way up in Maine.
Yeah.
So it's bigger than that. But early on, for really the first half, it is primarily the Salem Village and Salem people.
Yeah. So do we have any information on the general vibe of Salem once the witch trials are over? Because like I'm assuming a lot of people have to go back and live next to the neighbors who accuse their wives and daughters of witchcraft. That seems like a recipe for stabbing. Like, how do you live next to someone that, accused your and could have like essentially murdered your wife over accusations?
I think this is one of the more interesting angles, and it was something that I definitely wanted to include in the book, in the sense that there's so many excellent books on the witch hunt, but many of them just end when the trials are over. And
Yeah.
with this question, it's always been in my mind as well, like, well, the people are still there. They're still on the farm next door. And what we know is, so the witch hunt ends because more and more people were realizing it was wrong. It doesn't take time afterwards to realize this. They realized it first, and that's why they pressure the government to end it. So people knew that it was not correct.
Hmm.
Maybe people differed in terms of blame or intent, but they knew it was not right. And we have disputes that linger, especially between the Nurse family, the families of Rebecca Nurse's two sisters, who are also accused of witchcraft, and Reverend Paris, because he ends up testifying against people. He then, when the witch hunt is over, keeps being the Salem Village minister, like nothing happened, and never admits he was wrong. And these families will not attend his church. They keep attending church. They just go to one in a neighboring town. But they will not worship with Reverend Paris ever again. And it takes about 6 years to run him out of town.
Yeah. I mean, that makes sense. I wouldn't go to the mass being led by someone who's telling me to be a good person, and then they got people murdered from witchcraft accusations. Like if Reverend Paris comes to your house in the aftermath of the witch trials, and he's like, "Hey, can I borrow a cup of sugar?" And then the guy's like, "Well, yeah, let me ask my wife. Oh, wait, she's dead because you accused her of witchcraft. Get the hell out of here." Like the level of pettiness, awkwardness, anger, divisiveness must have been at an all-time high, just like for societies in general after that, because you can't just pretend like it didn't happen.
And it's afterwards that we see the village really kind of fracture. That there had been theories about the witch hunt as kind of what I mentioned earlier about it was a plot or a conspiracy of Reverend Paris attacking his opponents. He didn't really have opponents prior to that. Now he does afterwards. There's going to be a pro-Paris group that want to keep... Yeah, there are people who still want to keep him. Typically people related to the accusers, of course. Mm. And there's this anti-Paris group that at town meetings, at meetings of the members of the village church, keep trying to vote to oust him. And so you will end up with two factions. You didn't before, but as an effect, there are two clear... A line has been drawn, and it really is just what role had your family had in the witch trials.
To fast forward to today, when you see people using the phrase today, quote unquote, witch hunts, to describe powerful people or, relatively powerful, well-known people getting canceled on Twitter, when you see people using that phrase to describe those sort of accusations, what do you think of that?
I remember particularly a couple years ago when this first sort of like bubbled up in discourse, talking to some other people I know who were researching the witch hunt. And we were talking about this as, is it going to get more people interested in the witch hunt? Is this belittling the witch hunt? Like, how is this going to play out? And we were all a little worried that it was the belittling, and it, especially that when you hear that phrase used, it is, as you mentioned, used by very powerful people. And the idea of a witch hunt is the people being targeted are not that. Yeah. They are the people on the outside of society, like we discussed about the first few who were accused of witchcraft that were almost like cast out by Salem Village, were not considered real Salem villagers because they were a slave or they were a beggar. And so with witch hunts, the targets are very different than people who claim to be targets today. In fact, it's kind of the exact opposite.
Yeah. I mean, there's a huge difference between J.K. Rowling and Rebecca Nurse. Like Rebecca
Yes.
Nurse is one's a billionaire and one was a sick old lady that didn't have much money. So I guess if you were gonna use the phrase witch hunt with Twitter mobs, a more accurate depiction would be a guy just sweeping his floors, minding his business in a normal house or apartment, and then all of a sudden he sees a million tweets like "fuck you, go die," like "go to hell," and he's just like, "What?" Like, I'm just a normal guy. Like, what is happening?
You're right that it would be an average, normal person who
Or woman, more accurate.
You're right. Well,
Yeah,
yes,
normal woman.
absolutely. That if they were a target of something, and again, it's all unjustified. None of these people were witches. None of these people deserved any accusation against them in 1692. So it's a truly innocent person who's not powerful, just being, truly victimized for something they never did. It's not their fault.
Yeah. So looking back on the trials, would you say that the non-mentally ill witch accusers were just the Karens of the 17th century? Like, they're not getting something, they're not getting attention, something they want, and they're just like lashing out, calling people witches. Like, there's no underlying mental illness. There's some desire to just take people down for little to no reason.
There have been some articles, books written to that effect. I'm not sure I would personally buy it. There had been some things, especially in the 1970s, about sort of like feminist interpretations, not of the people accused, but of doing the accusing, which was a new kind of take on that.
Yeah.
And the idea that they were teenage young women, nobody listened to them or cared what they said. They had no influence over their lives. And that, yes, suddenly they found a way to have control. I mean, I agree in terms of the way that their position in society is described. That seems to be the case.
Yeah.
I would say I think that the falsehoods really come from maybe they first accuse somebody because of a psychological reason, but they just have to keep it up now because it's too late to go back, especially once the first person's killed. Like, you have to be committed and you have to keep coming up with new evidence. And so I almost see them as trapped. It's their own fault in the sense that they are still unwilling to tell the truth. They have many opportunities to tell the truth and they don't. But they've trapped themselves.
Yeah, you could say a lot of things about the accusers, but one thing isn't that they're not committed. They take commitment to a whole new level. There's a very popular theory, especially when you're searching around on Reddit, or even a lot of scientific magazines will talk about the ergot infestation theory, which is that the rye grain in Salem may have been infested with ergot, which has psychedelic qualities, and that causes convulsions, spasms, hallucinations. Is there any truth to the theory that ergot poisoning or ergot ingestion may have indirectly led to the witch trials, or even directly caused the hallucinations, spasms that have been documented?
There is none. This is a theory that has lived on for decades. It's first put forward in the late 1970s. And within 6 months, it was like devastatingly refuted. Yet somehow, I would say again, back to more like the way it's portrayed in media. I think in particular with like television specials, love to talk about this theory because you imagined, those straight-laced Puritans suddenly, like, as if they had done acid with this ergot, and they're seeing things, and there's something like, I think almost like amusing or entertaining about that idea. But there is it cannot make sense. It does not fit the evidence. First of all, they knew about ergot back then. The doctor would have noticed it. It's something that the symptoms don't match. Ergot, if a family would have all eaten the same bread. And so if it comes from the mold on the rye, it would have affected the youngest first or the worst. Well, there were younger children in Reverend Paris's house that never had fits. So
What
that
is that?
doesn't
Just because
work.
of the dosage would have been more to a small child than an adult, so they would have seen it in them first.
Yeah, you're
Okay.
exactly right. Yeah, it would be just like if you think of a medicine dose that they would have had
Yeah.
a different effect. Also, to me, what I think is, well, there's two things. Number one, also the fits seem to happen at convenient moments, like when Rebecca Nurse is found not guilty briefly. A physical illness doesn't come and go
Yeah.
conveniently. But the biggest symptom that doesn't match, we have people in 1692 who write down the wildest and craziest things. True or
Hmm.
untrue? Or mostly untrue.
Yeah.
But wild and crazy things. And one thing Ergot does to you, in order to have hallucinations, it has to have gotten to the point that you have gangrene and your fingers are turning green and falling off.
Mm.
And lack of evidence cannot be used as evidence. But if people had fingers falling off, I am very confident someone would have written that down.
Oh yeah. If I saw someone with a green hand in 1692, I couldn't yell witch loud enough. I feel like
Hmm.
that would be uh that would be like, to me, if you're telling me that the same people who were getting ergot poisoning with green hands were also the witches, I would think that that's why witches are depicted like being green, like in, the Wizard of Oz, or but if it wasn't connected to the actual accusations, like if there's nothing that says that this person was convulsing and they also had a green left foot, then it seems like that would have been something to be mentioned, if like you said, they're writing other crazy shit down as well.
Yeah, and very detailed descriptions that really, if somebody had been looking or unfortunately suffering that way, that would have been like the best evidence against somebody at a trial. So
Oh yeah.
the idea that it never comes up just doesn't fit.
Yeah, that I mean, the Rebecca Nurse probably wouldn't have had the not guilty verdict first if she had a green left hand. Like that probably would have been enough to just, say, you know torture on the spot. I'm sure back in 1692.
Mm.
To end off, what are the greatest lessons that we can learn from the witch trials and Rebecca Nurse's story specifically? What should we take away from that?
I think this is probably the most key question in the sense that we study history, we read books about interesting things in history for its own sake, but also to try to be better and to hopefully try to not make mistakes that people have made in the
Yeah.
past. And we unfortunately have so many mistakes. First of all, it's the idea that one should be skeptical of people being accused of something unless there is very credible evidence. Um, when you have someone like Rebecca Nurse who is standing there and very like calmly but insistently saying that they are innocent, that they didn't do this, that the evidence is not proving them guilty, that is something to think about. We've improved our criminal justice system leaps and bounds since
Mm.
1692. I am sure quite often people are still convicted who are not actually guilty. So that I think
Oh
is
yeah.
one lesson.
Yeah.
Um, the other kind of part of it is, well, the way that it all ends really kind of is like one of the first like public pressure campaigns against the government of Massachusetts. And it works because the governor realizes this is politically becoming a liability for him and he might lose his job. He's afraid someone's going to write to the king and tell him that the guy you picked to be our governor is doing this terrible thing and he'll get fired. So, in a sense, that sort of like public movement, public action actually can matter and stop something that's bad, because that really
Yeah.
is what did it here. It's ministers giving sermons against the witch hunt, writing letters to the governor, ordinary people writing letters to the governor, pointing out flaws in the process, and it actually has an impact. And it doesn't work soon enough, but it does work.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, Dan Gagnon, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I really do appreciate your time and the way you so interestingly and expertly laid out the story of Rebecca Nurse. Where can people best follow your work and follow you? And where can people pick up A Salem Witch, the trial, execution, and exoneration of Rebecca Nurse?
I would say in terms of picking up the book in person at the Rebecca Nurse Homestead is always the best. Online, the Salem Witch Museum has a website you can buy it through, as well as it's available at like all national bookstores and Amazon and Bookshop and such. For my work, I have a website, danielgagnonhistory.org, and I am also on Twitter or whatever it is, X now, as Dan Gagnon USA.
Awesome. And I'm going to link that wherever people are listening to this, watching this, and put it in the intro as well. And if for those of you listening and watching, if anything even remotely piqued the curiosity in your brain during the conversation, which I'm sure multiple things did, you should definitely go check out the book, because there are dozens of twists and turns that we didn't even get into, and a lot of very interesting information still left untapped that it's impossible to fully comb through in an hour and a half conversation. So definitely go check that out. Again, thank you so much, Dan. This has been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you, Zach, very much for having me on. It was my pleasure to be here.
Yeah, of course.